There is a saying among the older species of the galaxy, passed down through 1,000 cautionary lectures. Never test a creature you do not understand. The Velmari Academy of Xenobiological Sciences had forgotten that saying, or perhaps had never bothered to learn it, and on the day Professor Halvex Dorn decided to demonstrate his life's work in front of a hall full of alien students, he was about to relearn it in the most humiliating way possible. The lecture hall sat on the 14th level of the Academy spire, a vast bowl of curved seating that could hold nearly 300 students from across 9 star systems. Chinless Vraxa folded their long limbs into seats built for their frames. The gelatinous Ooth pulled into specialized containment chairs that kept their forms from sliding onto the floor. Furred Sennarii groomed themselves nervously while waiting for the lecture to begin, and in the back row, mostly ignored, sat the only human in the entire building. His name was Milo Reyes, and nobody in that room expected him to matter. Milo had been enrolled in the exchange program for exactly 4 months. He was quiet. He took notes by hand instead of using the neural uplinks everyone else favored, which the other students found charmingly primitive. He ate his meals alone in the corner of the commissary, chewing through nutrient paste with a kind of grim determination that suggested he found it every bit as unpleasant as it looked. He asked few questions in class. He raised his hand even less. If you had asked any professor in the building to name the least remarkable student on campus, most of them would have landed on the skinny human in the back row without even needing to think about it. That was, of course, precisely the mistake everyone kept making about humans, and it was a mistake the galaxy had been making for longer than anyone cared to admit. Professor Halvex Dorn was not a cruel man, not exactly. He was, more precisely, a supremely confident one, the kind of confidence that came from 40 years of tenure and a research career built on being right more often than he was wrong. He was tall and slate-gray, with a bony ridge running down the center of his skull that pulsed faintly when he was excited, and today it was pulsing quite a lot. Today was the day he unveiled the culmination of a decade of research. Today was the day he got to show off. He stood at the front of the hall beside a squat black device roughly the size of a serving cart, humming faintly with a note so deep it seemed to vibrate in the student's teeth. Cables ran from its base into the floor, feeding it more power than a lecture hall demonstration had any reasonable need for, but Dorn had never been a man to undersell his own accomplishments. He tapped the side of the machine affectionately, the way another person might pat a loyal dog. "Settle down," he said, his voice amplified slightly by the small transmitter clipped near his throat. "Settle down, all of you. Today, we are not merely going to discuss theory." A murmur ran through the hall. Students who had been idly grooming or chatting straightened in their seats. "For 10 years, Dorn continued, the Xenoacoustic Division has been mapping the neurological resonance frequencies of every known sapient species in the charted galaxy. We catalogued the Vraxa, we catalogued the Ooth, we catalogued the Sennarii, the Crevache, the Idobel, and 41 others besides. And what we discovered, what nobody before us had the courage to discover, is that beneath all our surface differences, all sapient nervous systems share a common resonance vulnerability, a frequency band buried deep in the architecture of thought itself." He paused there, clearly savoring it, the way a performer savors the silence right before the reveal. "Today," he said, "I am going to demonstrate the universal disruption frequency, a signal engineered to destabilize the neural resonance of every sapient species in this room simultaneously, harmlessly, and completely. What you are about to witness has never before been shown outside a secured laboratory. Consider yourselves privileged." Milo, in the back row, kept writing in his notebook, unbothered. He had heard 100 professors promise 100 groundbreaking discoveries. He would believe it when he saw it. A Vraxa student near the front, mandibles clicking nervously, raised one segmented limb. "Professor, will this hurt?" Dorn's ridge pulsed with something like amusement. "You will feel a moment of profound disorientation, some minor discomfort. It is, I assure you, entirely temporary and has been rigorously tested. Consider it a valuable data point in your education. You are not merely students today. You are subjects in a historic experiment." There was scattered nervous laughter, the kind people make when they are not sure whether they are supposed to be scared. Milo glanced up from his notebook just long enough to note that nobody around him seemed thrilled about being a historic experiment, and then went back to his notes. Dorn moved to the console built into the side of the black device and began entering commands, his long fingers dancing across the panel with the ease of long practice. The pulsing hum from the machine deepened, dropped an octave, then another, sinking into a register that seemed to exist, less as sound and more as pressure. "The frequency I am about to broadcast," Dorn explained, still narrating for the benefit of the room, still relishing every second of it, targets the resonant harmonics of the thalamic analog structures present in every sapient brain architecture we have catalogued. It does not matter if your species processes thought through electrochemical, signaling, bioluminescent pulse, or gelatinous ionic transfer. The frequency reaches all of them. This is, without exaggeration, the most significant unifying discovery in xenobiology in the last century. He looked out over the room, his ridge pulsing bright with pride. "Behold," he said, "the great equalizer." He pressed the activation key. The device let out a low, rolling tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, seeping up through the floor, through the chairs, through the very air. It was not loud. It was not, to Milo's ears, even particularly unpleasant. It sounded a little like a foghorn played underwater, distant and strange. And then the room fell apart. The Vraxa students dropped first, their long limbs folding in on themselves as they collapsed from their seats, mandibles clattering uncontrollably against the floor. The Ooth students in their containment chairs seemed to lose all cohesion at once, their gelatinous forms sagging and rippling in visible agony, colors flashing rapid distress patterns across their translucent bodies. The Sennarii screamed, a high, keening wail of pain, clawing at the sides of their skulls as they tumbled from their seats. Every single alien species in that lecture hall, every single one of nearly 300 students, crumpled to the floor in what looked like genuine screaming agony. The sound was horrific, not the frequency itself, which Milo still could barely register as more than a strange hum, but the sound of 300 students in simultaneous, synchronized suffering. Claws scraping tile, bodies convulsing against chair frames. A cacophony of alien cries in a dozen different registers, all of them unmistakably real. Professor Dorn stood at the console, momentarily frozen, watching his life's work unfold exactly as intended. His ridge pulsed with something close to euphoria. This was it. This was the proof. This was the moment that would be replayed in academic journals for decades. And then his eyes drifted to the back row, and the euphoria curdled into something else entirely. Milo Reyes was laughing, not screaming, not clawing at his skull, not collapsed on the floor in agony like every other sapient being in the room. He was sitting upright in his chair, one eyebrow raised, a slow grin spreading across his face, shoulders shaking with what was unmistakably genuine, delighted laughter. "Oh, that's a good one," Milo said, to no one in particular, still chuckling. "That's actually kind of funny." Dorn stared at him. For a long moment the professor's mouth simply hung open, the sound of 300 suffering students filling the silence between them. "You," Dorn said slowly, disbelief creeping into his voice, "should be incapacitated." Milo shrugged, wiping a small tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. "Sorry, I don't really feel anything." "Is it supposed to tickle? Because it kind of tickles." The professor's ridge, which moments ago had pulsed with triumphant pride, now flickered erratically, the alien equivalent of a man's confidence draining out through the soles of his feet. Around Milo, the suffering continued unabated. A Vraxa girl, 2 rows down, someone Milo vaguely recognized from a shared study group, was curled into a trembling ball, mandibles clicking in distress. An Ooth student's containment chair had tipped sideways, spilling translucent gel across the floor in a way that looked deeply, deeply wrong. This was not showmanship. This was not exaggeration for dramatic effect. These students were genuinely suffering, and Milo, for reasons the professor could not begin to fathom, appeared to find the entire situation delightful. Dorn lunged for the console and slammed the deactivation key. The tone cut off instantly. The hum died, and the hall, which had been a chorus of shrieking pain seconds before, dissolved into gasping, ragged breathing as students slowly, painfully picked themselves back up off the floor. The professor stood very still for a moment, processing. Then, because he was the kind of man who had built 40 years of a career on being the smartest person in any given room, he did the only thing his pride would allow him to do. He decided there must be an equipment malfunction. There must be a calibration error, he announced, mostly to himself, moving quickly back to the console and pulling up a diagnostic display. The output should be uniform across the frequency band, perhaps a hardware fault in the emitter array. Perhaps, Professor, said a Vraxa student near the front, still shaking slightly as she pulled herself upright. With respect, I do not think that was a malfunction. Dorn did not look up from the console. Nonsense. The frequency is calibrated against 44 known sapient neural architectures. It is theoretically impossible for a fully catalogued species to remain unaffected. With respect, Professor, the student tried again, glancing nervously toward the back row. Humans were only added to the catalog 8 months ago, during the provisional survey. There was a pause. Dorn's ridge flickered again, and this time there was something almost like dread beneath the confusion. He turned, slowly, to look at Milo again. Milo, for his part, had settled back into a more relaxed posture, one arm draped casually over the back of his chair, watching the scene unfold, with the mild, faintly entertained expression of a man watching a toddler try to stack blocks that were clearly too big for the tower. "You're telling me," Dorn said, his voice tight, "that the human resonance data in our catalog is provisional." "It was extrapolated," said a young Ito Bell teaching assistant near the console, his voice small, "from a single sample gathered during the initial diplomatic contact 7 years ago. There has never been a full survey." Human physiology was assumed to be broadly similar to Sennarii, neural architecture, given superficial biological parallels. "Assumed," Dorn repeated the word, coming out of him like something bitter. "Yes, Professor." Dorn's gaze crawled back to Milo, and something in his expression shifted from confusion into a kind of wounded, stubborn defiance. This was the reaction of a man who had spent a decade building a reputation on a discovery, and who was not, under any circumstances, prepared to have that reputation undone by a single unassuming student in a back row seat. "Perhaps," Dorn said, straightening. "The emitter's output was simply insufficient to reach the human threshold. A matter of amplitude, not architecture. If I increase the output—" Around the room, several students who had just barely recovered from their ordeal turned pale, or the equivalent, at the prospect of a second demonstration. "Professor," said the Vraxa student carefully, "perhaps that is unwise." "Nonsense," Dorn said again, though there was a brittleness in his voice now that had not been there before. "Science demands rigor, and if the human specimen was simply undersaturated by the initial frequency, a second, stronger pulse will confirm it." Milo, still lounging in the back row, raised a hand. It was such a small, ordinary gesture. A student raising a hand to ask a question, but the entire room seemed to still around it. Nearly 300 students who had just been writhing on the floor in agony now turned to watch the exchange, with the fixed, breathless attention of people watching a landslide begin. "Professor," Milo said, his voice easy, almost friendly, "can I ask you something before you do that?" Dorn's ridge pulsed, wary. "What? Do you know why humans weren't fully catalogued yet?" Quote, "I assume," Dorn said stiffly, "because your species is a recent addition to galactic diplomatic circles." "Sure," Milo said. "That's part of it. But there's another reason. Every survey team that's tried to do a full neurological workup on a human volunteer has come back with the same problem. And what is that?" Milo smiled, and it was not an unkind smile, but there was something underneath it that made the professor's ridge flicker uncertainly. "Human nervous systems are a mess," Milo said. "Genuinely, evolutionarily speaking, we're a disaster. We didn't get built clean and elegant, like most of the species you've cataloged. We got cobbled together over a few 100 million years by a planet that kept trying to kill everything on it. Radiation spikes, ice ages, supervolcanoes, 6 mass extinctions, and we crawled out the other side of every single one of them. Our brains ended up wired with about 4 different backup systems stacked on top of each other, because nature kept trying new designs without bothering to remove the old ones first. The hall was very quiet now.
What that means,
Milo continued, is that most single-point neurological attacks that would drop other species instantly just sort of bounce off us. Not because we're tougher, because we're weirder. Our resonance profile doesn't look like anything else you've cataloged because it isn't one profile. It's about 6 different backup profiles wearing a trench coat. Dorn's fingers had gone very still over the console. That is, he said slowly, an extraordinary claim. It's not really a claim, Milo said. It's on file. Ask your provisional survey team what happened when they tried to run a standard neural saturation test on the last human volunteer 8 months ago. I bet there's a report somewhere that got quietly buried because nobody wanted to admit their brand new universal frequency didn't actually work on the newest species in the catalog. The young Ito bell teaching assistant, who had been standing near the console this entire time looking increasingly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. There was, he said, a report filed by the initial contact survey team. It was flagged as an anomaly. It was scheduled for a follow-up study that never happened due to budget constraints. Dorn turned to look at him with the slow, dangerous calm of a man realizing he was the only person in the room who had not read the fine print. "What did the report say?" Dorn asked. The assistant swallowed. It said that standard neural disruption techniques produced, quote, negligible to no measurable effect on the human test subject, and recommended further study before drawing conclusions about broader human resonance vulnerability. And why? Dorn asked, his voice climbing several degrees towards something less composed. Was I not informed of this before conducting a live demonstration in front of 300 students? The assistant said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. Dorn turned back to Milo, and for the first time since the lecture began, he looked less like a confident professor and more like a man standing on ground that had just been revealed to be considerably less solid than he had believed. "You could have said something," Dorn said, "before I began. You could have asked," Milo said mildly, "before you decided to test an experimental neural weapon on a room full of students without checking whether it actually worked on all of them first." There was a ripple of sound through the hall that might, under different circumstances, have been called a laugh. If any of the assembled students had felt entirely safe laughing at a professor, with the ridge on his skull pulsing that particular unhappy shade of blue. Dorn's jaw tightened. Pride, once wounded, tends not to retreat quietly, and Halvex Dorn had never in 40 years been the kind of man to retreat quietly from anything. "Very well," he said, turning back to the console with brisk, overcompensating energy. "If the human resonance profile is genuinely as robust as the student claims, then this is not an obstacle. This is an opportunity. A live, willing test subject offering to help us complete the catalog that has sat incomplete for 8 months. I will simply need to adjust the output parameters and run a more thorough scan." He began entering new commands into the console. Faster, now, the pulsing of his ridge shifting from wounded to something more like manic determination. Milo watched him work for a moment, then glanced sideways at the Vraxa student nearest him, the one who had spoken up earlier. She was still trembling faintly from the first pulse, mandibles clicking with residual discomfort. "Hey," Milo said to her quietly. "You doing okay?" She blinked at him, several of her eye clusters focusing on his face with an expression that, translated roughly into human terms, might have been something like bewildered respect. "That was extremely painful," she said. "You did not seem to feel anything at all." "Nope," Milo said. "Not really. Is that normal? For humans?" Milo considered the question honestly, which was more than he had expected himself to do at 11 in the morning on what was supposed to be a routine lecture. "Depends what you mean by normal," he said. "It's normal for us to be hard to affect with stuff like this." It is not normal for someone to try it on a room full of unconsenting students without a much better plan. Then, trust me, it'll be fine. At the console, Dorn's fingers moved faster. I am recalibrating the emitter to a broader spectrum, he announced loudly, partly to the room and partly, it seemed, to reassure himself. If the human resonance vulnerability exists across multiple overlapping bands, rather than a single frequency, a swept pulse across the full spectrum should locate it. Professor, said the young Idobel assistant, his voice climbing with something close to panic. A broad spectrum sweep at that output level would also re-expose every other student in the hall to the original disruption frequency, likely at a higher combined intensity. Dorn did not slow down. Then they will simply need to endure it a second time. In the name of scientific progress, the hall, which moments before had been murmuring in nervous relief, went very still and very cold. Milo's easy, amused expression did not change much, but something behind his eyes sharpened, the way a person's expression sharpens when a mildly annoying situation quietly crosses over into something they are no longer willing to find funny. He stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He did not slam his hands on the desk or raise his voice. He simply stood, in the quiet, unhurried way of someone who has decided a conversation has reached its natural conclusion, and started walking down toward the front of the hall. Professor, Milo said, I'd stop typing if I were you. Dorn glanced up, irritation flashing across his features. This does not concern you, Mr. Reyes. You are, by your own account, unaffected. You may sit back down. It concerns me plenty, Milo said, continuing his walk down the sloped aisle between the seats. Because you're about to hurt 300 people who already told you this was a bad idea, just so you don't have to admit you got something wrong in front of a room of students. I am attempting, Dorn said, his voice rising, to complete 10 years of research. You're attempting to save face, Milo said. There's a difference, and everybody in this room can tell which one it actually is. He reached the front of the hall now, close enough to see the fine tremor in Dorn's long fingers as they hovered over the activation key, close enough to see the wounded, cornered look in the professor's eyes. The look of a man who has built his entire identity around being the smartest person in the room and cannot conceive of any version of events where that stops being true. Step away from the console, Milo said. His voice had not gotten louder. If anything, it had gotten quieter, and somehow that made it land harder than shouting would have. Dorn's ridge pulsed erratically. You would presume to give me orders in my own lecture hall. I would presume, Milo said, to stop you from torturing 300 students a second time, because your feelings got hurt. For a moment, nobody in the hall moved. The only sound was the faint residual hum of the device, still warm from its first activation, waiting. Then Dorn's hand twitched toward the console. Milo moved. It happened fast enough that several students later, describing the moment to friends who had missed the lecture, struggled to agree on exactly what they had seen. What was clear was that between one heartbeat and the next, Milo had crossed the remaining distance, closed his hand around Dorn's wrist, and firmly, without any excess force, guided the professor's hand away from the console and held it there. Dorn stared down at the hand around his wrist with an expression of pure astonishment, as though gravity itself had just reached up and corrected him. You, he said, are remarkably strong, for a species you claim is, what was the word, a disaster. We're a disaster that had to survive things that wanted to eat us for a couple 100 million years, Milo said. Turns out, that builds a decent grip strength along with the weird nervous system. He did not let go of the wrist. Here's what's going to happen, Milo said, and his tone had shifted now, no longer amused, no longer particularly warm, settling instead into something calm and level and entirely unshakably certain. You are going to power down that device. You are going to file an incident report about a demonstration that caused unintended harm to your students. And you are never, under any circumstances, going to point that thing at another sapient being without full informed consent and proper safety review ever again. And if I refuse, Dorn said, though the fight in his voice had already started leaking out of it. Then I walk over to the campus administrator's office, Milo said, and I explain that a tenured professor knowingly used an unlicensed neural weapon on 300 students, was warned by student testimony and prior documented research that a subject in the room was unaffected and chose to escalate the output anyway rather than stop and check. I don't think that conversation goes well for you, do you? Dorn said nothing. His ridge had gone pale, the pulsing color drained down to a dull, defeated gray. Slowly, Milo released his wrist. The professor did not move for a long moment. Then, with the stiff mechanical motion of a man performing an action his body did not want to perform, he reached over and powered down the console. The faint residual hum died completely. The hall filled instead with something that felt, for the first time since the lecture began, like actual quiet. "I was," Dorn said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier grandeur, attempting to advance the field. "I know," Milo said, not unkindly. "That's not really the problem. The problem is, you decided the fastest way to advance the field was through people who didn't get a say in it." He turned to look out at the recovering students, most of whom were still watching the front of the room, with expressions somewhere between shock, relief, and dawning. "Hesitant respect. Anybody hurt bad enough to need the infirmary?" Milo asked, and the question came out easy, almost gentle, a complete tonal shift from the cold certainty of a moment before. There was a pause, and then, slowly, hands went up. Not many. A handful of students, mostly Sennarii, who had taken a hard fall from their chairs during the initial collapse. "Okay," Milo said. "Let's get you looked at." He moved through the aisles, helping students to their feet, an arm offered here, a steadying hand there, working with the unhurried practical efficiency of someone who had clearly done this kind of thing before, in some other life, under circumstances nobody in this room knew anything about. The Vraxa girl from earlier accepted his help up with visible surprise. "You did not have to do that," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the room, toward the confrontation that had just ended. "The professor could have escalated. He could have refused." "He could have," Milo agreed. "But somebody had to say no, first, or nobody in this room was ever going to." "Why you?" Milo considered the question for a moment as he helped her steady herself against her chair. "Because it turns out," he said, "that thing doesn't work on me. And when you're the one person in the room a threat can't touch, you don't really get to just sit there and watch it happen to everybody else. That's not really a choice. That's just what you do." DS Twed of what happened in Professor Dorn's lecture hall spread through the academy faster than any research paper he had ever published. By the following morning, the story had traveled through every department, embellished in places, softened in others, but the core of it remained stubbornly, undeniably true. A professor had used an experimental weapon on a room full of unconsenting students, ignored the warnings of the one person unaffected by it, and had been calmly, firmly overruled by that same person before real harm could compound into something far worse. The Academy's Ethics Board opened a formal review within the week. Dorn's research funding, which had once seemed a permanent fixture of the university budget, was suspended pending a full investigation into the device's development and testing protocols. His decade of work did not vanish entirely, but it was quietly, thoroughly stripped of the reckless human cost that had almost been added to its ledger and reassigned to researchers with considerably more respect for the concept of informed consent. The provisional entry on human neurological resonance in the Academy's official species catalog was updated within the month, no longer marked provisional, filled in with careful new data gathered. This time, with Milo's full and willing cooperation, under proper oversight, with proper safeguards. And, with a formal note attached, recommending that no future disruption research be attempted on human subjects without extensive additional study, given the demonstrated resilience of the species' neural architecture. Milo did not become famous. Not exactly. He was not the kind of person who wanted that. And the galaxy, for all its strangeness, still had room in it for a young man who preferred a quiet corner of the commissary and a notebook full of handwritten notes. But something in how the other students looked at him had shifted, permanently, unmistakably. The Vraxa girl from the lecture hall started sitting near him in class. Others followed. Small conversations became small friendships. The lone human in the back row was, quietly, no longer quite so alone. Professor Dorn, for his part, delivered a formal apology to the assembled student body 2 weeks later, his ridge pulsing the dull, chastened gray of a man who had learned the hard way that 40 years of expertise did not entitle him to certainty about things he had never actually tested. It was not a warm apology, it was not especially gracious, but it was, notably, an apology which was more than anyone in that lecture hall had expected to hear from him a month earlier. Milo did not gloat about any of it. When asked, later, by a curious student, what he had been thinking in that moment, standing calmly in a room full of collapsed, suffering aliens while everyone stared at him in disbelief, his answer was simple, almost anticlimactic, the kind of answer that somehow said everything anyway. He said he had not been thinking about the frequency at all. He had been thinking about how strange it was that an entire room full of brilliant, accomplished students from across the galaxy had spent their whole lives assuming the quiet human in the back row was the least remarkable person in the building, right up until the moment it turned out he was the only one standing. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more tales just like it, and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next one. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in Milo's shoes, and whether you think Professor Dorn ever really learned his lesson. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and never underestimate the quiet ones in the back row.